The sound of shattering glass pierced the quiet evening as Josephine Evans stumbled backward into the general store's display window, her cheek stinging from the blow. It was 1878 in the dust-blown town of Rattlesnake Creek, Wyoming Territory, and the promise of a new life was quickly turning into a nightmare. "You think you can just walk away from me?" growled Harvey Thornton, his breath reeking of whiskey as he advanced toward her. The storekeeper who'd hired her just 3 days ago was nowhere to be seen, having closed up early due to the approaching storm. Josephine touched her cheek, feeling the warmth of blood from where Harvey's ring had cut her skin. 6 weeks in this frontier town, and already she regretted leaving Boston. But after her father's death and the subsequent discovery of his overwhelming debts, she'd had little choice. "Please, Mr. Thornton, I've told you I'm not interested," she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Harvey lunged forward, grabbing her wrist with such force that Josephine gasped in pain. "No woman says no to me in this town," he snarled, his face contorted with rage. The sound of approaching hoofbeats barely registered until a deep voice cut through the tension like a knife. "I believe the lady made herself clear." Harvey whipped around, still clutching Josephine's wrist. A tall figure dismounted from a chestnut stallion, spurs jingling as dusty boots hit the wooden boardwalk. "This ain't your business, Garwood," Harvey spat. Josephine looked up at her unexpected defender. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt. His face, partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, bore the weathered look of a man who'd spent years under the merciless western sun. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, piercing blue, like the sky after a summer storm. "When a man puts his hands on a woman against her will in my town, it becomes my business," the stranger said calmly, though there was steel beneath his words. "Your town," Harvey laughed bitterly. "Last I checked, you're just a hired gun, Garwood." "Last I checked, I'm the marshal of Rattlesnake Creek," the man replied, pushing back his coat to reveal the silver star pinned to his vest. "Now let her go, or we're going to have more than words between us." For a moment, Josephine thought Harvey might fight. His grip tightened painfully around her wrist before he suddenly shoved her away. She stumbled backwards, colliding with a barrel. "Fine, she ain't worth the trouble anyway," Harvey muttered, spitting on the ground before stalking off toward the saloon. As Harvey's footsteps faded, Josephine felt her knees weaken. The marshal moved quickly, catching her before she could fall. "Easy there, miss," he said, his voice gentler now. "Are you all right?" I think so," she whispered, suddenly aware of the strong hands steadying her so different from Harvey's brutal grip moments earlier. "Name's Lucas Garwood," he said, helping her to a nearby bench. "Town marshal." "Josephine Evans," she replied, wincing as she touched her bruised cheek. "I'm sorry to be a bother." Lucas frowned, pulling a clean handkerchief from his pocket and offering it to her. "You're no bother, Miss Evans. Thornton's the trouble. He's been warned about his behavior before." As she pressed the handkerchief to her cheek, Josephine noticed how carefully Lucas was examining her injuries, his eyes filled with concern rather than the leering interest she'd grown accustomed to from men in town. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her wrist where angry red marks were already forming. She nodded, surprised by the gentle way he took her hand, turning it carefully to examine the bruising. His calloused fingers were unexpectedly tender. "These'll need some tending," he said with a frown. "The doctor's just down the street." "No, please," Josephine said quickly. "I don't have money for a doctor." Lucas studied her face. "Then my sister's place is closer. She's got a knack for healing, worked as a nurse during the war." Before Josephine could protest, a rumble of thunder echoed across the plains, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. "Sounds like we don't have much choice," Lucas said with a small smile, offering his arm. "Can you walk, or would you prefer to ride?" Josephine hesitated, then placed her hand carefully on his forearm. "I can walk, Marshal, thank you." "Lucas," he corrected, leading her toward his horse. "Just Lucas is fine." As they made their way down the street, the skies opened. Lucas removed his coat and placed it around her shoulders in one fluid motion. The warmth of the garment and the scent of leather, tobacco, and something distinctly masculine enveloped her. "It's not far," he assured her, leading his horse with one hand while keeping the other protectively near her elbow. Through the curtain of rain, Josephine caught sight of a small white house at the edge of town. Light glowed from within, promising warmth and safety. Lucas's sister, Martha, proved to be a kind-faced woman with the same striking blue eyes as her brother. She clucked with concern at the sight of Josephine's injuries and immediately set about preparing hot tea and gathering supplies. Harvey Thornton again. Martha asked Lucas as she gently applied a cool compress to Josephine's cheek. Lucas nodded grimly, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "I should have run him out of town months ago. You can't solve every problem with a gun or a jail cell, Luke," Martha chided gently. "Some men need more correction than others." As Martha tended to her wounds, Josephine learned that Lucas had been marshal of Rattlesnake Creek for 3 years, taking the position after returning from scouting for the Army. Before that, he'd been a rancher until raiders had burned his property during the war. "There now," Martha said, finishing wrapping Josephine's wrist with a clean bandage. "These bruises will heal, but you shouldn't be alone tonight. That man might come looking for you again." "I have a room at Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house," Josephine said, suddenly realizing how vulnerable she would be there. "Mrs. Whittaker's is clear across town," Lucas said, frowning. "And that old lock on your door wouldn't keep out a determined child, let alone someone like Thornton." "You'll stay here tonight," Martha announced decisively. "I've got a spare room and I could use the company. Luke can fetch your things tomorrow." Josephine opened her mouth to protest, but was silenced by another roll of thunder that shook the small house. "I insist," Martha added with a warm smile. "Any woman brave enough to stand up to Harvey Thornton is welcome under my roof." Later, after a simple but filling supper, Lucas prepared to leave. The storm continued to rage outside, but he insisted on making rounds despite Martha's protests. At the door, he paused, turning to Josephine. "Miss Evans, I promise you Thornton won't trouble you again." Something in his tone made Josephine believe him completely. "Thank you, Marshal Lucas, for everything." He touched the brim of his hat. "Rest easy tonight." "Remember what I told you about my hands?" Josephine tilted her head in confusion. "Your hands?" A slight smile softened his weathered features. "Some men use their hands to hurt. Mine will only ever be used to protect." With that, he stepped out into the storm, leaving Josephine to ponder his words as Martha showed her to the spare bedroom. "My brother's a good man," Martha said as she laid out a nightgown for Josephine. "One of the best, though life hasn't been kind to him." "He saved me tonight," Josephine replied softly. "I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't come along." Martha's expression grew serious. "Luke has a strong sense of justice, but there's more to it than that. I haven't seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you tonight since Sarah died." "Sarah, his wife," Martha explained, smoothing the bed covers. "Yellow fever took her and their baby boy 6 years ago. He hasn't let anyone close since." Josephine felt a pang of sympathy for the marshal. "That's terrible." "Yes, it was, but perhaps it's time for new beginnings," Martha said with a knowing smile before bidding her good night. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as though the storm had washed away all traces of darkness. Josephine woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Her body ached from the previous day's ordeal, but the sharp pain had dulled to a manageable throb. She found Martha in the kitchen, humming as she tended to breakfast. Through the window, Josephine spotted Lucas chopping wood in the yard, his movements powerful and precise. "Good morning," Martha greeted warmly. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you," Josephine replied, self-consciously touching the bruise on her cheek. "I should probably return to town soon. I don't want to lose my position at the store." "Luke rode over to the general store at first light," Martha said, placing a cup of coffee before Josephine. "Mr. Peterson was quite concerned about you and said to take all the time you need." Relieved, Josephine sipped the hot coffee. Outside, Lucas set down the axe and wiped his brow with his sleeve. Something about the simple, domestic scene made her heart flutter unexpectedly. "He's been up since before dawn," Martha commented, following Josephine's gaze. "Always keeps busy when he's troubled." Before Josephine could respond, Lucas entered, bringing with him the scent of fresh air and sawdust. He paused briefly when he saw her, and something flickered in his eyes that made Josephine's breath catch. "Miss Evans," he said, removing his hat, "you're looking better this morning." "Please call me Josephine," she replied. "And thank you again for your help." Over breakfast, Lucas explained that he'd made arrangements with Mr. Peterson for Josephine to stay with Martha for a few days until her injuries healed. He'd also had a stern talk with Harvey Thornton, who'd been locked in the town jail overnight to sober up. "He won't be bothering you again," Lucas assured her. "I made that very clear." "And if that message doesn't stick, half the town's ladies have offered to form a committee to make sure it does," Martha added with a mischievous gleam in her eye. Word spreads fast in Rattlesnake Creek. After breakfast, Lucas insisted on showing Josephine around the small property. The house sat on the edge of town with a view of the distant mountains, a modest garden plot, and a small stable where Lucas kept his horse and Martha's mule. "It's not much," he said, almost apologetically as they walked, "but it's peaceful." "It's lovely," Josephine said sincerely. After the crowded streets of Boston and the cramped boarding house, the open space felt like freedom. As they walked, Josephine found herself sharing her own story: her father's death, the discovery of his gambling debts, and her decision to answer an advertisement for shop girls in Wyoming territory. "It was either this or marry Mr. Clarence Bowman, my father's solicitor," she explained with a grimace. "He was quite eager to take a wife 40 years his junior in exchange for settling father's debts." Lucas's expression darkened. "Some men view women as property to be acquired, and you don't." The question slipped out before she could stop it. Lucas stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "A woman is a partner, not a possession. My father taught me that, and my time with Sarah only confirmed it." The conviction in his voice stirred something within Josephine. In Boston, even the most progressive men she'd known had viewed women with a kind of tolerant amusement at best. "Your sister told me about your wife," she said softly. "I'm sorry for your loss." Pain flashed across his features, but he didn't look away. "It was a long time ago, but thank you." The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm. Each morning, Lucas would ride into town for his duties as marshal, while Josephine helped Martha with household chores. Her bruises began to fade, but she found herself in no hurry to return to town. On the fourth day, Lucas returned early, leading a bay mare. "Thought you might like to see more of the countryside," he explained, looking almost shy, "if you're feeling up to it." The ride took them along a winding creek that gave the town its name, past meadows blooming with wildflowers despite the approaching autumn. Lucas pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the area's history. When they stopped to rest the horses near a stand of cottonwoods, Josephine noticed how relaxed he seemed away from town. "You don't really like being marshal, do you?" she asked as they sat on a fallen log, watching the horses graze. Lucas looked surprised by her perception. "What makes you say that? You're different out here, less guarded." He considered her words, absently twisting a blade of grass between his fingers. "I took the badge because the town needed someone after the last marshal was killed. Figured it would be temporary." He shrugged. 3 years later, I'm still wearing it. What would you rather be doing?" His gaze drifted to the distant hills. "I had land once, good grazing land about 20 miles north of here. Always thought I'd rebuild someday. Why haven't you?" Lucas was quiet for so long that Josephine thought he might not answer. "Didn't see the point, I suppose. A ranch is meant for a family." The simple honesty of his words touched her deeply. Before she could respond, a distant rumble of thunder reminded them of the unpredictable mountain weather. "We should head back," Lucas said, rising to his feet and offering his hand. They were halfway to town when the skies opened. Lucas led them to an abandoned line shack, a simple one-room structure used by cowboys during cattle drives. "It's not much, but it's dry," he said, helping her dismount before quickly seeing to the horses. Inside, the shack was dusty but intact. Lucas soon had a small fire going in the crude stone fireplace. Josephine stood near the warmth, trying not to shiver in her damp clothes. "Here," Lucas said, shrugging out of his coat and draping it around her shoulders. Can't have you catching a chill. But you'll be cold, she protested. He smiled, the firelight softening his features. I've weathered worse. As they waited out the storm, Lucas told her more about his life, his time in the war, his dreams for the ranch, the small herd of cattle he still maintained on a friend's property. Josephine found herself sharing her own hopes and fears, things she'd never told anyone. I don't want to go back to Boston, she admitted as the rain continued to drum on the roof. There's nothing for me there, but I'm not sure there's a place for me here either. Why not? Lucas asked, his blue eyes intent on her face. A woman alone has few options in this world, east or west, she said with a sad smile. I'm grateful for the position at the store, but it's hardly a future. You could make a life here, Lucas said quietly, if you wanted to. Something in his tone made her heart quicken. Could I? Before he could answer, a crack of lightning split the sky outside, followed immediately by a deafening clap of thunder. Josephine jumped and Lucas instinctively moved closer, his hand finding hers. It's all right, he said, his voice low and reassuring. We're safe here. His hand was warm around hers, calloused but gentle. When their eyes met, Josephine felt a current between them that had nothing to do with the lightning outside. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, wanted him to kiss her, but Lucas slowly released her hand and moved back. The storm's passing, he said, his voice a bit rougher than before. We should be able to head home soon. The word home lingered in the air between them, filled with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. By the time they returned to Martha's house, the sun was setting. Martha took one look at their damp clothes and flushed faces and smiled knowingly, but said nothing as she busied herself preparing a hot meal. That night, Josephine lay awake long after the house had gone quiet, replaying the day in her mind. The way Lucas had looked at her in the lined shack, the feeling of his hand holding hers, the sense of possibility that had surrounded them. It was foolish, she told herself, to read too much into a moment of connection during a storm. Yet she couldn't help but wonder if Lucas was lying awake too, thinking of her. The following week brought a flurry of activity to Rattlesnake Creek. A cattle drive was passing through, bringing cowboys with money to spend and high spirits to indulge. Josephine returned to her position at the general store, though she continued to stay with Martha, moving her few belongings from the boarding house. Lucas was busier than ever, keeping order as the town swelled with visitors. She saw him only in passing a tip of his hat as he patrolled the street, a brief exchange of words when he stopped by the store. Yet each encounter left her with a lingering warmth that lasted hours. On the third night of the cattle drive, trouble erupted at the Silver Dollar Saloon. Martha and Josephine were preparing supper when a young boy burst into the house without knocking. Miss Martha, come quick, the marshal's been hurt. Josephine's heart seemed to stop. Martha immediately grabbed her medical bag and they followed the boy at a run. The scene at the saloon was chaos. Tables overturned, broken glass everywhere, and in the center of it all, Lucas sat propped against the bar, a bloody rag pressed to his shoulder. It's nothing, he insisted as Martha knelt beside him. Just a graze. Let me be the judge of that, Martha replied, carefully pulling back the makeshift bandage. Josephine hovered anxiously as Martha examined the wound. What happened? Couple of drovers got into it over a card game, the bartender explained. Marshal stepped in to break it up and one of them pulled a knife. Where are they now? Martha asked, cleaning the wound with steady hands. Locked up tight, Lucas grimaced as Martha applied pressure, though I might have broken the tall one's nose in the process. Good, Josephine said with such fierce conviction that several men around them chuckled. Once Martha had determined that the wound wasn't serious, a deep cut that needed stitching, but had missed anything vital, they helped Lucas back to the house. Despite his protests that he could walk unaided, Josephine noticed how heavily he leaned on her, his usually steady stride faltering. Later, after Martha had stitched and bandaged the wound, Josephine brought Lucas a cup of coffee laced with whiskey for the pain. He sat at the kitchen table, looking pale but alert. You gave me quite a scare, she said softly, setting the cup before him. I've had worse, he replied with a wan smile that didn't reach his eyes. That doesn't make it better, Josephine said, surprising herself with the emotion in her voice. You could have been killed. Lucas looked up at her, something unreadable in his gaze. Would that have mattered to you? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all that remained unspoken. Josephine felt her heart pounding as she met his eyes. Yes, she whispered. It would have mattered very much. He reached for her hand then, his fingers intertwining with hers. Josephine, Martha's entrance interrupted whatever he had been about to say. The moment broken, Lucas withdrew his hand and reached for the coffee instead, though his eyes never left Josephine's face. That night, a soft knock on her bedroom door roused Josephine from restless sleep. She found Lucas standing in the hallway, looking uncertain. "I'm sorry to wake you," he said quietly, "but there's something I need to say, and I'm afraid if I wait until morning I might lose my nerve." Josephine pulled her shawl tighter around her nightdress. "What is it?" "I haven't felt this way about anyone since Sarah," he said, the words coming slowly as though each one cost him effort. "I didn't think I could feel this way again. Didn't want to, but then you came along and—" He trailed off, searching her face. Josephine felt her heart might burst from her chest, and, she prompted gently. "And I find myself thinking about the future again," he continued. "Not just tomorrow or next week, but years from now, a life that includes more than just doing a job I never wanted." He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes even in the dim light of the hallway. "I'm not a man of fancy words, Josephine, but I know what I feel, and I hope that you might feel something too." "I do," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I've never felt anything like this before." Relief washed over his features. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised his hand to cup her cheek, the one that had been bruised, his touch so gentle it was barely there. "When I saw Thornton hurting you that night," he said, his voice low and intense, "all I could think was that no one should ever touch you that way, that if you ever allowed me to touch you, my hands would only ever hold you tenderly." Josephine leaned into his touch, her eyes filling with tears at the simple, heartfelt declaration. Lucas, mindful of his injured shoulder, she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His arms came around her waist, hesitant at first, then more certain as she nestled against his chest. "I'm not asking for promises," he murmured against her hair. "Not yet. Just a chance to see where this might lead." Josephine looked up at him, all her doubts and fears dissolving in the warmth of his gaze. "I'd like that very much." His smile then was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, radiant with hope and possibility. When he lowered his head to kiss her, his lips were as gentle as his hands, making a promise that words could never fully express. As autumn gave way to winter, Josephine became an integral part of life in Rattlesnake Creek. Her keen mind for numbers made her invaluable at the general store, and her friendship with Martha blossomed into a sisterly bond. But it was her growing relationship with Lucas that truly transformed her days. They courted properly, with chaperone dinners and Sunday rides after church. Lucas showed her his land, walking the boundaries with her and pointing out where he'd build a new home someday. Josephine found herself offering suggestions: a garden here, windows facing the mountains there, and Lucas listened as though her opinions were precious gifts. On Christmas Eve, a heavy snow blanketed the town in pristine white. The community gathered in the small church for carols and prayers before dispersing to celebrate in their homes. Lucas had been mysteriously absent most of the day, but arrived at Martha's house just as they were lighting the candles on the tree. "Sorry I'm late," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Had an errand that couldn't wait." After dinner, as they sat before the fire with cups of Martha's spiced cider, Lucas cleared his throat nervously. "I have something for you," he said to Josephine, reaching into his pocket. "It's not much, but—" He placed a small wooden box in her palm. Inside, nestled on a scrap of velvet, was a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," Lucas explained, his voice rough with emotion. "My father gave it to her when they came west together. She always said it reminded her that even the most difficult journeys can produce something beautiful." Josephine looked up at him, her heart in her throat. "I love you, Josephine," Lucas said simply. "I want to build a life with you, a home, a family, a future. Will you marry me?" Yes, she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Yes, with all my heart. Martha discreetly wiped her eyes as Lucas slipped the ring onto Josephine's finger, then sealed their engagement with a tender kiss. They were married in the spring, when the prairie bloomed with wildflowers. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, even Mr. Peterson closing the store for the day. Josephine wore a dress of pale blue silk that Martha had helped her make, with sprigs of lilac in her hair. As they exchanged vows, Josephine couldn't help but marvel at the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months earlier, she'd been a desperate young woman fleeing one life with little hope for another. Now she stood beside a man whose strength was matched only by his gentleness, promising to share whatever the future might hold. "I, Lucas, take you, Josephine," he said, his voice steady and sure as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, "to be my wife, my partner, and my heart's home. I promise that these hands will only ever hold you tenderly, protect you fiercely, and work alongside yours to build our life together." After the ceremony, as guests celebrated with food and music in the town square, Lucas drew Josephine aside. "I have a surprise for you," he said, excitement gleaming in his eyes. He led her to the edge of town where a wagon waited, loaded with supplies and hitched to a pair of sturdy draft horses. "What's all this?" Josephine asked, puzzled. "Our future," Lucas replied, helping her up to the seat. "I've been working on it for months." As they crested the hill that overlooked his property, Josephine gasped. Where there had been only open prairie and the remnants of an old foundation, a small cabin now stood, smoke curling from its chimney. "It's just a start," Lucas said, suddenly uncertain as he watched her face. "2 rooms for now, but we can add on as needed. The barn's only half finished, and I know it's not what you were used to in Boston." Josephine silenced him with a kiss. "It's perfect," she whispered against his lips. "It's ours." That night, as stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky, Lucas carried his bride across the threshold of their new home. Inside, everything was simple but made with care: a sturdy table and chairs, a bed covered with a colorful quilt Martha had pieced, shelves lined with the few books they owned. "Welcome home, Mrs. Garwood," Lucas said, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her. Josephine looked up at the man who had changed her life with his integrity, his kindness, and his unwavering belief in her strength. "I never thought I'd find a place where I truly belonged," she said softly. "But home isn't a place, is it? It's a person." Lucas smiled, drawing her closer. "For me, it's you. It's always been you, even before I knew you existed." As his lips found hers, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together with strength, with courage, and always, always, with the tenderness that had healed her heart and given her a future she had never dared to dream possible.